But I guess going back to your comments, President Picker, was this is obviously a two-way street. If we have statutory requirements that, for whatever reason, can't be fulfilled, I think those items need to be discussed, either, like you said, through the budgetary process, through the committee process, so we can understand how we manage this and how we have a plan forward. I believe, our vice chair and Mr. Olbanalti's questions in terms of your answers. Well, we hope at some point you get back to us with answers, but also a plan of action so that we can move forward and satisfy these requirements, because we get phone calls and we're obviously people ask us that. So it's a situation where we're all in this together, and I think we all need to move forward together.
Well, I think our strategic planning process will help us to actually start to think not just how we do things better the way we've always been doing it, but start to figure out where do we need to be in 3 to 5 years. What do we have? What are the steps we have to take to get there? What realistically are the resources that we have to have? But really importantly, what are the skill sets that we don't have that we need? How do we actually continue to learn from the people who are there and have a rich history, but also start to pass along the knowledge to another generation? We are like many other government and private agencies, are seeing a significant aging of our workforce, and so we have to get prepared for that. But as we make those transitions, I think we'll bring in new skill sets and new aptitudes that will actually help us do things in a more efficient, effective, and different way. And so that's part of our challenge.
Great, and I look forward to that process, and I would just urge that you revisit the mission, the organizational mission, and refocus on that very important core competency that you were set out and created to deliver. I think it's more important today than ever.
Thank you, Mr. Tang. Are there questions from any other members who have not asked a question yet? Mr. Hernandez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And President Picker, I wanted to congratulate you on your new post. And also, I had a few questions. I was listening from the office, and I heard some commentary about the departure of some of the security inspectors, and I'm thinking, my curiosity is, what's the pathway there to close the gap there? If you kind of speak to that.
Well, I was using the example of the phase down of our motor carrier division as the commercial trucking industry was deregulated, and what it means to the culture of enforcement to not have that large mass of people who go out into the field every day and actually conduct field interrogations, take field notes, collect evidence, build a case file, and actually do it knowing that, as they did at that time, that they would actually send them out to local DAs for prosecution instead of taking it through our processes. So, and I think that it is a challenge for us. We, as I pointed out, don't have good IT systems that allow us to keep consistent records in the same fashion across the state. But I'll just point out that we chose a new director for our Safety and Enforcement Division who has been very aggressive about using the citation program in both gas distribution system violations. The Carmel type incident in PG&E's territory has been aggressive elsewhere in the state, is using it in terms of fixed guideway transit, otherwise known as light rail. So I think that we're starting to build that up. But I will say that we have a ways to go. We need to actually get more effective training in terms of what it means to do field work to build an enforcement case. We need to be able to set up systems to track those from our first contact, which could be a advisory call to say, hey, we've spotted this problem. Like, get back to us what you're going to do about it, to actual notice of a violation that ages, and then starts to move to the point that we're going to take a couple of these notices of violation and put them into a citation, or where we notice that the practice is so widespread throughout a company. That I think we need to reestablish and rebuild. And so I think that we will see from the staff there what they think they need in terms of the kinds of tools, the right kinds of skills, the right kinds of structure. But again, I think there's some other things that we'll need to build that will help on the other side in terms of rate setting for some of the regulated utilities as well, the safety advocacy. I also want to say that we have some real notes of excellence in our organization, and I would encourage anybody who hasn't looked at the crude oil reconnaissance team down in Bakersfield. These are trained inspectors. They mostly look at tracks and crossing guards. But they knew that we were going to start to see some of these very volatile Bakken crudes starting to come to California. But it's hard for us to know, given the limits of our regulatory authority, which trains are carrying those crudes. We know which of them have crude oil because we can read the placarding like everybody else, but we don't know their volatility, and we don't always know where they came from. And so these guys figured out that it's got to go someplace, and most of the refineries in California aren't designed to take those very light fractions, that you need a different kind of piping system and structure. And so they started doing something that's a little out of the normal for people who go out and look at railroad tracks and crossing guards. They went to planning departments and started looking at whether people were pulling new permits. And they started to find the places where they thought they were likely to go. They backtracked then to double down in terms of their safety inspections on those lines. They worked with the city of Bakersfield to identify especially dangerous crossings and where improvements were needed. And I have to compliment them for that. And they are very aggressive in terms of their enforcement efforts, but we have very limited authority, so it's very hard for us to build much out of that. We have to basically work with the Federal Railway Administration when it comes to actual prosecutions. So I think we're going to have to, in some cases, look to see if we can actually get additional authority. An example would be FINSA pointed out that our maximum fine for a pipeline safety violation is $50,000 per incident per day, whereas the national standard is $200,000. So I think that we have a long ways to go, but it's going to be this patient task of building from the bottom up to really make it work. And I just want to introduce Elisaveta Malashenko, who's our new Safety and Enforcement Division Director.
Great. Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And then one more question. It's kind of
Next year you should ask us the same question.
Very good. Thank you. I think we will. The next question just kind of piggybacks off some of the sentiment and kind of concern that was expressed by a couple of my colleagues, Mr. Williams and Mr. Ting, speaking more to the institutional culture. Given some of the strong criticism, some suggested, some outright accusation of the closeness between CPUC and the entities in which you're charged to regulate over, to watch over, to keep a close eye on behalf of the California citizenry. I'd like to know kind of specifically of now with your tenure as president and with new changes on the horizon, what did some of these changes look like in terms of addressing the public imaging, the change in institutional culture as to how we create that firewall, and where we can prove to the citizenry that there is a firewall in terms of the level of influence that these IOUs would have on to the staff. I know that you spoke about turnover. There's been a lot of turnover. So from one aspect, maybe you speak to it on from the standpoint of what are we doing to retain these young, bright minds that are part of the organization that we want to keep, where we want to see longer tenure there, so that there isn't a lot of that fleeting. We experience it here in the legislature as well, and rules committees looking at how we can improve that situation here. I'd like to hear what CPUC is doing to implement some culture changes on that front. Ultimately, though, I think what the biggest concern for us as lawmakers is how do we go back to our taxpayers, our bosses, and say they're doing it right. One, they're not close, they're not overly influenced, and I don't know if right now I can say that and look at my constituents truthfully and say I feel confident that that's not happening. I want to get there. I want to believe that you want to get there, but I'd like to be able to go back to my constituents and say, look, I asked a question, and these are some of the specifics that were given to me about how there's going to be more security put in place to make sure that this over-influencing isn't taking place, how we're embedding a cultural practice that brings up the talent there, and that there's systems in place, right, so that what is driven, as you pointed out earlier, comes straight from the data and is centered on what's best for the ratepayer first and foremost.
Well, I think that I talked a little bit about what I think we need to do at the top, which is that the commissioners themselves actually have to act and behave in ways that set a model for the staff. I think that the staff will always have a challenge that they are not decision makers, but they are the feet and hands by which we operate. They're always going to have to be in more intimate contact with operations at utilities. They're going to have to talk to people. So I'll let our executive director talk a little bit about what he's trying to do in terms of comportment. But I think that the commissioners actually meeting in public, discussing these issues, adopting a code of conduct, discussing what really makes sense in terms of stronger ex parte that is effective, that actually allows us to be more than just commissioners in a box. I worry that there are things that we don't know that we have to bring into the record. We won't know that if we don't talk to all of the parties. I mean, one of the Virginia process is that everybody, none of the commissioners can talk to anybody. And I'm not sure that that works in California, given the fast pace of change that we're seeing in industries. We have to have some curiosity as commissioners, or else we'll miss things that we need to bring into the record so that we can base our decisions on that. But I think that the question of how we do that, we're going to have to really work out. I will say, before I pass it over to the executive director, that I don't believe we're going to image our way out of this. It's going to take a while, and what we're going to have to do is build the kind of organization where everybody can see it, they can hear it, they can feel it, but I don't think that it's our image. It's our actual behavior and what we do and how we do it that will make a difference. And we have a ways to go, I think, before we can actually operate in ways that are as effective and visible to people that they can actually have faith in it. So I wouldn't expect it to be a fast process. And I'm sorry that it puts you in the position of having to say that it's not the agency it needs to be, but I think that it's going to take a little while to get us there. I'm sorry, but I'm working on it.
Good enough.
So,
Good enough.
Hi, thank you for the question. As executive director, I'm working on it too, from a different perspective. One of the first things I did after becoming executive director, I went to the city of San Bruno. I met with the city manager and the city attorney, and they told us that they didn't care much for the PUC. They thought we were too close to the utilities, and they thought we weren't concerned about safety. Well, that was hard things to hear. I've been working at the commission for 30 years, but I think it's given us an opportunity to turn things around. And I can tell you some of the steps we're doing. The first thing, on the 65,000 emails, they're now being reviewed by a core team of managers, and for those that are inappropriate, we plan to either counsel the employees or take formal action with the state discipline system for specific things. We also plan to have a mandatory training course about how to communicate with email and how to maintain the formal relationship that's needed between a regulator and a regulatee. We're putting together the course. We plan to field it in April. Then finally, the longer term of changing culture, I think the culture arises from the actions you do. And one of the things we're doing in safety is we developed a safety work plan that has us do certain things, commits individuals to do them on a timetable. And we think by taking the steps, that will begin to address the culture. But like President Picker said, there's no real easy answer. We didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to get out of this situation overnight. But we do have, this has given us an opportunity to look at ourselves and to try and do better. And as long as I'm here, that's why I took the position. I have only been in less time than President Picker, about 12 weeks. And the idea is to turn it around, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hernandez. If no other members who haven't asked questions don't have questions, I'll ask a few. I wanted to return to the issue of songs, the San Onofre nuclear generating site. During the 1980s, PUCs in Montana, Missouri, California disallowed disallowed some costs from being added to the rate base because of mismanagement of construction projects. Yet here, in the case of songs, the decision was that 2/3 of the costs related to songs would be passed on to ratepayers instead of shareholders. And so I was curious the extent to which, and I think this cuts at the decision-making processes and the way that decisions are made at the PUC. Given that there was a precedent for disallowing costs relating to mismanagement, how did the PUC arrive at this decision relevant to songs?
As best I can reconstruct it from my reading of the record, essentially there was a long discussion within the commission as to how you actually figure out what really should be charged to the rate base and what should not be charged to the rate base. And so what the commission did is hired some experts and did some research and tried to assign the date at which it was most reasonable to assume that you couldn't make the nuclear generating station work. And so some of the infrastructure that was in place before then was just assumed to be part of the rate base. At the point that it became very clear that you could not make the system functional, everything beyond that went to the cost of the utility. So these are very big, costly pieces of infrastructure, and I don't know what the best way is to figure out how much of it you disallow and how much you allow. That was eventually the process that we settled on, and then it just became a matter of trying to do the accounting to figure out what fell after that date and what came before that date.
Okay.
So that's in a snapshot.
Okay. Also relating to, and again, this pertains to a lot of the issues that we've talked about with respect to transparency, but also with respect to your decision-making process. It's come to the surface that in late March, your predecessor held detailed discussions with Southern California Edison's chief legal counsel in Warsaw, Poland, regarding the outline of a potential settlement on songs. This was during a period when the Commission had made an active investigation of the songs matter and more than 2 months before the settlement process started at the Commission. Among the ethical concerns raised by these meetings is that if Southern California Edison knew ahead of time what your predecessor wanted to see in a settlement, then Southern California Edison could easily manipulate the record to achieve the terms they pre-negotiated with the President. To what extent did this now infamous meeting in Warsaw potentially undermine, taint, or inappropriately predetermine the outcome of the song settlement?
I don't think I can really answer that question in full. That's, I think, in part some of the issues that two different investigative agencies are looking at, the state AG and the Federal Department of Justice. And I've partly stood aside from trying to reconstruct that just so that I might not know things that that other people can't read in the newspapers. I can't be accused of disclosing to any potential defendants things that might help them to avoid prosecution. So I'm just going to have to depend on them to tell us whether there was misdoing. I can't really form effective judgments on things that I read in the newspapers because I don't know exactly what the newspapers have, what they don't have. I'm going to leave that to the justice system. I do know that as somebody who actually voted on that, the only thing that I had to make a decision on was the record. And so it looked to me like it was built out of discussion and public testimony. Everybody else had that same record, and that's about all I can really offer you.
Okay. With respect to these meetings, Southern California Edison has refused to release internal emails related to the meetings with your predecessor. Will the PUC compel Southern California Edison to release those emails, and when will the PUC be releasing its emails?
I don't think we've been asked to in a formal way. I will be honest with you that we'll hit the same roadblock that we do under any document that we have to review for public disclosure. We'll have to submit it to our Public Utilities Code 583 screening before we get to the Public Records Act. There are specific things that relate to potential legal confidential documents that we can't disclose. There's also trade secrets and third-party information. Until we have a request, until our attorneys start to grind it through, I can't really give you an answer. I will say that if we do get the request, then that's probably going to be added to the list of 220 other Public Records Act requests. Generally, when you get a Public Records Act request, my experience from having worked around it, frequently people will ask for everything in the world. You try to get them to be more specific. If they ask for everything in the world, it takes a long time to give it to them. And frankly, they're unhappy because they get everything and they can't find the things they actually want to see. So I think, in all fairness, people are probably going to have to be patient because we are all working very hard around the clock to grind through those other 220 Public Records Act requests. We're not allowed under the Public Records Act requests to set priorities. We just grind through them.
And I believe you said earlier there are something like 220 pending Public Records Act right now? Okay. I think most of my colleagues are aware of the potential litigation between Southern California Edison and Mitsubishi. And the settlement negotiated by or approved by the PUC allows Southern California Edison to keep 50% of any funds recovered from its litigation with Mitsubishi. Why should Edison be allowed to recover anything for its investments in songs relevant to the replacement steam generators?
I think it has to do with the question of whether they fairly and honestly procured equipment that they had good reason to believe would function in the way that it was intended to function, and whether having been sold bad technology, whether they are required to take all the blame for that.
Thank you. The next set of questions dealing with energy efficiency, wages, and promoting diversity in hiring. The investor-owned utilities are investing substantial ratepayer funds in energy efficiency programs throughout the state. Many of these funds earmarked for energy efficiency or installation are contracted out to external parties. There are currently no wage standards, local or targeted hire requirements in place to ensure that ratepayers' investment benefits the diverse communities that the IOUs serve. We know that the IOUs have been mandated to begin integrating workforce inclusion practices into their energy efficiency and demand-side management portfolio. According to a study, a 2014 UC Berkeley study on the green economy, many of the low-wage jobs generated by ratepayer investment tend to concentrate in the residential sector, particularly in the Energy Savings Assistance Program. To achieve better outcomes, shouldn't the IOUs expand their approach and pair programs that train entry-level workers for energy efficiency work with policies that require employers in higher-paid, higher-skilled fields?
I don't disagree. All I'll say is that I voted against that proceeding.
Okay, thank you. Another question about employment practices. PG&E's Power Pathways program is an example of I think it's a really great example of a program that provides entry-level opportunities in diverse communities. What have the IOUs done to date to replicate programs such as Power Pathways throughout the IOUs and the energy efficiency portfolio?
I'll say that I don't understand how they do that through their energy programs. I have a better understanding of how their overall supplier diversity programs work, and I continue to stay focused on that piece of our proceeding. It came out of legislation that was authored by Gwen Moore, and over the last probably decade, the utility expenditures on jobs and businesses in our diverse businesses in our communities has gone from about $1 billion to $9 billion currently. So I think that that's the overall approach that we've taken, is to require them to constantly justify their progress in terms of trying to meet a standard of actually procuring from diverse communities within their company. It may be that there are other approaches we should examine more fully, but I'll just kind of point to that progress as being one way that we do that. It is not universally applied simply because we just use the broad test as opposed to focusing in specific areas.
Got it. The IOUs have also been asked to collect data on jobs and workforce outcomes, not only for the low-income programs, but also for broader energy efficiency programs. What progress has been made by the IOUs on collecting data on job quality and workforce diversity?
I don't think I can really speak to the energy efficiency programs. I've always been very uncomfortable with our new generation of energy efficiency programs, so I don't think that I can speak to the lack of progress in that specific area. I'll just kind of point to the fact I don't think we're hitting our marks anywhere there, despite a good staff at the PUC.
Uncomfortable from
we are depending on energy efficiency programs to help us meet our energy goals, and I just think that the $1.3 billion that the utilities are spending every year on energy efficiency are not hitting the goals, and we can't point to any of our analytics as actually telling us why some things are working and other things are not. So that has real importance. So in places like Southern California, between San Diego and Orange County, if we know that we have a target there to meet our energy reliability goals, and we can't tell why we're getting energy efficiency, not getting energy efficiency, but we know we're falling short of our expectations, the program doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you.
That's a lot of money for a program that I'm not confident in.
Agreed. I have a next question deals with PUC's oversight. As I'm sure all of my colleagues know, the PUC oversees a myriad of different areas. In addition to telecommunications and gas and electricity, you also oversee a number of different types of public utility water systems. With respect to water, IOU water companies such as Golden State Water Company, for example, which serves at least two cities in my district, they often charge much higher prices for water than municipal systems. I represent the city of Bell, which has several different water systems within the same city. There are residents in our city who will literally walk across the street to take a shower at their neighbor's home because the water prices in their home are so expensive because their provider is Golden State. Why are IOU prices so often much higher than nearby city water agencies?
I'll say that I actually went to the hearing in Huntington Park for the Golden State water contract in the Central Basin. My understanding is still growing, but many of these privately owned utilities have their own water supply. They're not well integrated. They don't have the economies of scale, for example, that LADWP has, or ownership of their own water supply at a larger scale. And so they frequently have to dig deeper to get water to meet needs. We find that this is especially a problem for some of the smaller ones. Over the years, we've seen the number of private utilities actually drop as they get amalgamated into either larger private utilities or into to municipal utilities. And I think that when you start to see that, then you get a little more rational pricing. I worry sometimes that I don't know how to value or to improve the service and the pricing of these private utilities who are disconnected and have to have separate infrastructure for each of their service areas because they don't actually get the economy of scale. So these are all questions that I ask and I can't answer yet.
So, as you know, I'm glad you were in Huntington Park. As you know, this is a problem. Huntington Park, Bell, Hawaiian Gardens. I received a visit last year from residents and city officials from the city of Claremont who were, at the time, were paying $400 to $700 water bills, residential water bills on a monthly basis. It's probably no surprise to you or to me or to anyone that the city recently, the city is trying to use eminent domain to take over that water system in their community. So with respect to those communities, are you willing to assist, is the PUC willing to assist city governments in objecting to and perhaps challenging IOU water rates?
Well, I think that we take their testimony just as we take everybody else's pretty seriously, and we look to them to help us build a better record. I wish that it was easier for local governments to actually spend the time and energy that it takes to actually follow one of our proceedings. So if they have ideas on what would make sense for them to actually be more effective participants, those are the kinds of questions that I'm constantly asking. I'd like to hear from them.
Thank you, Mr. Picker. Do any other committee members have any additional questions? Thank you, Mr. Picker. Thanks for being here today. There were, I know you're in a tough spot. I represent a lot of cities where there are new councils, new staff. I represent, I've said this before, I represent 9 cities, of which 5 have former council members in prison. And you have these new councils that have inherited exceptionally difficult situations. And I know that to a large extent you're in that same boat. We wish you success, and we want to work with you. There were questions today that we didn't receive answers to, and we may call on you in the future to get those answers. But thank you for your time.
Okay. Thank you very much. I look forward to working with you.
Thank you.